Welcome everyone to Logan City Council Library's special Library Lovers Day event. This will be podcast, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce and welcome our presenter, author and journalist Susan Johnson. Susan has recently released a new book, The Landing, and I really enjoyed the lyrical writing in this book. It was the setting and the colourful cast of characters that had me hooked right from the start. Susan's book knits together themes that run through her other novels: eroticism and sensuality, expatriation, writing and art, and the complexity of relationships between men and women. Perfect themes, I believe, for a Library Lovers Day event. A little bit about Susan before I hand over to her. Susan describes herself as an author, incurable Australian, friend, feminist and mother. She has lived for many years in the UK, France and Greece, and returned to Brisbane in 2010 with her two sons. Susan has been writing fiction since 1985. She has also had a successful career as a journalist, working for the Courier Mail, the Australian Woman's Weekly, the Sun Herald, the Sydney Morning Herald and the National Times. Currently, Susan is an adjunct professor in creative writing at Queensland University of Technology and writes for the Saturday Q Weekend magazine in the Courier Mail. Would everyone please make Susan feel very welcome?
Thanks very much, Deborah. And can everyone hear me? Thank you. And thank you all as well for giving up your precious time on a Saturday to come along. It's just fantastic to see so many people here. So thank you very much, all of you. And happy Valentine's Day for tomorrow. Happy Valentine's Day. Are there any worst words in the English language? I mean, all the vastness and pain and complexity that is love squished down into this tiny little box. All the magnificence and horror pressed down as if to nothing into this sort of meaningless little card that everyone buys. Valentine's Day is really only for those lucky, lucky people experiencing something that's now referred to as limerence. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of that term. It was invented by this wonderful American psychologist, Dorothy Tenove, and she wrote this book called Love and Limerence, The Experience of Being in Love, in which she interviewed about 500, 600 couples and compressed this idea of what we feel when we say we're in love down to a few lines. She defined it as, this is limerence, and I'm going to distinguish between limerence and love in a minute. But limerence is an involuntary interpersonal state that involves intrusive, obsessive and compulsive thoughts, feelings and behaviours that are contingent on the perceived emotional reciprocation from the object of interest. In other words, it takes two to limerence. Limerence isn't a crush where the other person doesn't even know of your existence. It's not stalking when one's mental state becomes criminally unhinged by someone who doesn't want anything to do with you. And it's definitely not the sort of feeling of ownership that, and I'm sorry, I think there are only one or two blokes in this talk, which is interesting in itself because love is considered a female thing rather than a male. And there are lots of decent blokes out there, but there are also many, many blokes who confuse, and it is mainly men, confuse ownership with love as well. And we all know that at the moment there's a lot of domestic violence matters in the paper, and there's that guy who's been stalking, who was accused of sending texts to that young woman who may or may not have thrown herself off a building because of him, but certainly he's harassed many other young women as well. And lots of men do confuse that with love. But getting back to limerence, and I'm sure all of us in this room have experienced this feeling, is that ecstatic feeling when you not only experience yourself as beautiful, but the whole world as beautiful. You're kind of formed by this feeling into that joyful charged feeling when your eyes fall on your beloved person, that you think only him or her is your soulmate, and there's only one other single person in the whole of the world who understands you. So limerence is what causes men to propose, or women to propose. It causes people to leave their wives or their husbands, or it causes young people to rush off to be together. And it's probably to blame for the fact that statistically, and this is really interesting, arranged marriages have just as much chance of working, if not slightly higher chance of working and going into long-term happiness and satisfaction as matches of love. So, in other words, limerence isn't love. Love is something else. It's not that kind of feeling that causes you to rush off. And I'm sure everyone in this room also knows that love is far, far, far trickier than it's advertised, right? Love can turn to hate in seconds. Love can feel like rage sometimes. It can feel like bliss or like a very ordinary workaday thing. Most people, I'm sure, know that last line from Philip Larkin's beautiful poem, An Arundel Tomb. It's actually, when I lived in London, I actually went to have a look at it. It's actually in Chichester, but it's a tomb, it's a stone effigy of two actual people who lived in, I think it's the 16th century, in that area. And it's the most beautiful stone effigy of them, which is considered to be possibly a true representation, except their faces have worn away now. But he is lying like that, but he's got one hand clasped next to the hand of his dead wife, in the effigy, I mean. And that's become a very famous line, the last line of that poem. Philip Larkin wrote a poem about it called An Arundel Tomb. And I'm sure many of you will know it because it's been used in books and films, and it's become very famous. And what will survive of us is love. Have you all heard of that? But the thing about this wonderful line is that everyone forgets the lines that come before it. And I'm just going to read out what those are, because there's something infinitely more complex and tricky. Time has transfigured them into untruth. The stone fidelity they hardly meant has come to be their final blaze, and to prove our almost instinct, almost true, what will survive of us is love. So I'll just go back to the lines before it. Our almost instinct, almost true. How we wish to believe it. How we wish to know that this love we feel for our husband or our wife or our boyfriend or our girlfriend is permanent, locked up, sealed away, turned into a stone effigy or something. Forever is what humans crave. Forever is what we all want. And forever is what that stone statue of a dead husband and a dead wife give us, letting us look away from the fact that actually today 1 in 2 marriages will end in divorce. 1 in 2 now. We want love to outlast our flesh, our earthly history, which is why movies such as 4 Weddings and a Funeral, Notting Hill, Love Actually, I adore those movies, and I'm sure a lot of you do too. And books such as The Rosie Project, which is so uplifting and so wonderful. Even 50 Shades of Grey, and I'm sure there are many of you who like that book. I didn't, but there's many. I'm in a minority. It's outsold the Bible. So it has outsold the Bible. And a book like The Notebook is also incredibly popular. And I'm sure all of you know here as well, personally, stories of love, real love, and not just limerence. Parents who care for disabled children. I've got a friend in Melbourne whose daughter is profoundly autistic, who still wears a nappy. She's 16. That's love. That's my friend getting up every single day and tending to that little girl, well, her young daughter, young woman. That's love in action. That's love made manifest. And I've got this theory that love, is not really a word, it's a practice. You can't actually talk about love until you practice it. And, people kind of understand it through our actions. A husband who keeps visiting his wife every day who's got dementia, who doesn't even know that he's there, that's love. The wife who chooses to stay in a marriage to a man. I've got a friend who chose to stay in her marriage even though she fell in love with another man, because she got married very rashly as a young girl. She was about 22. And they really don't have much in common at all, really. But they have three children, and she wants to be that old lady with an old husband surrounded by grandchildren in a photograph on the mantelpiece. That's what she wants. So to me, that is love. The fact that my friend has chosen that over her own desires. Love is getting up early to do the school lunches, and who hasn't done that for 53,000 days? Or ironing a shirt for your partner. Love is definitely putting in a call to your children or your husband or your wife to tell them that you love them when you're trapped in one of the twin towers. Anyone remember the transcripts of those calls? That is love. I mean, that was just amazing, wasn't it? And love is my own late grandmother, Molly, who got pregnant to my late grandfather, Colin, when she was 15 years old. So she had her first baby when she was 16. She had my mum when she was 18. And she lived with my grandfather, despite the fact that both of them had left school very early, obviously, for very obvious reasons. But my grandmother was very bright, and she got a job first in a like handbag store, when you had beautiful handbag store that actually smelt of leather, and the bags were beautiful, and she knew all the different bags from, they bought them in from Italy, and she worked her way from there to a job at David Jones. Has anyone read the Ladies in Black, or the Women in Black? Well, my grandmother was one of those, and then she became a buyer for David Jones. And she was very talented. She became a big fashion buyer for all the women's, in this is in Sydney, and my grandfather still worked in factories, and he was a wool classer and things like that. And it became apparent that she'd have to go to company dinners and things like that. And my grandfather, she was always a bit embarrassed because he had a tat when tats weren't popular, and he was a working class Aussie guy, and he wouldn't dance and things like that. But she absolutely stuck by him. He was very funny. She kept laughing at all his jokes. He was a very funny man, and he actually died in her arms on the kitchen floor when he was 75. So love to me is Molly laughing at all Colin's jokes all the way through, and it was her belief and faith in love that saw her marry within the year. And she was married for her second husband, and when he died, she got married again. My grandmother was married 3 times before I was married once. So she was one of the inspirations, and we've just spoken about the inspirations of the people in the landing. I'm not sure how many of you have read it, but there I was making a speech at my grandmother's 3rd wedding. And she was just she had such faith in love, and she was so irrepressible that the character of Marie in this book, who's a French woman who's 87, was very much inspired by my own grandmother. And it really, and seeing that expression of love really reflects my own belief that love is actually another word for life. I think that what it is our willingness to keep going on, to be connected with each other. That's often the only thing keeping us alive. And I know if anyone's here suffered depression or knows anyone else who suffers from depression, it's when that last link fails, when that connection between one person and another breaks down, that's when everything's lost. That's when the will to life is lost too, and that's when suicide happens. So despite everything, despite all the difficulties and traumas of love is actually in the end what anchors us to life. Now, one of the things I've written about a lot is family love. And I also think the creators of that ABC show, A Moody Christmas, stole my idea, because I had a book called Life in 7 Mistakes, which is about a Christmas on the Gold Coast. It came out, many years ago. Except that that book was set at Surfers Paradise. And I've also written another novel called Flying Lessons, which is again about love. And what I'm interested in is how we keep returning to families again and again who insult us or maybe belittle us or demean us, who have no understanding of who we are. Just yesterday I was talking to a friend, I came back from Stratty, about her 90-year-old father, who is quite frankly just, is a really bad-tempered old bully. He's really not, he's an old bee, really. But there she is, she's 64 years old, and she can't quite still escape the need to kind of get his approval, which is really about winning his love. And my feeling is that parental love, whether that's of the parent of the child or the child of the parent, even that 64-year-old friend of mine, it's possibly the greatest love story of all of them. I've stood by the bedside of another friend in London who was 78 years old, who was a psychologist, and I think possibly compelled to be a psychologist because of her own wounds of childhood. She was dying herself, and yet she was 78 years old, crying on her deathbed about her mother having preferred her sister to her. You know, these things are very, very powerful things that we take all through our lives. And my memoir, A Better Woman, which I think might be out of print now, but my publisher is thinking of reissuing it, that tells the story of my own birth traumas. I had a very rare first world birth complication. It's called a fistula. There's a clinic run by Dr. Catherine Hamlin in Ethiopia, who does a lot of good work with African women who are often ostracised from their families and lose everything because of this condition. So it's a very, very common condition in third world countries, but not in first world countries, and certainly it's very rare for that condition to lead to a temporary colostomy, which it did with me. So for me, my experience of childbirth and having children was very, very challenging. And, one of the lines in my book is knowing everything that happened, would I go through it again? Would I have my children again? And the line is, yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. And I think anybody who's a mother or a father will relate to that in some way. But yet, when I tell you that story about those boys who I loved with every fibre of my being, they could also unhinge me at moments in such a way that I felt like dashing them against a rock. Now, that's the other side, like it's such a complex knot, the love, the knot of love. It's another thing I talk about is... I don't know if any of you are Edith Wharton fans, but I'm a huge fan of her. In fact, I prefer her to Henry James in lots of ways. I think she's much more explicit. She wrote a beautiful memoir called Looking Back, I think, or Looking Backwards. And she talks about writing being so journalism to me is like the composed face of a tapestry. But what you need to do, and what Edith Wharton says good fiction does, is turns that tapestry around so you can see all the knots and everything that's made it. And that's really what love is. It's the back of the tapestry, isn't it? It's all those knots as well. It's not the nice little surface at the front, which is the Valentine's Day card. It's really the back of the tapestry, and everybody knows that. Everybody knows that. So I'm very, very interested in the concept of love. And My 100 Lovers, which was the book before this, everyone thinks, oh, that's, a very thrilling title. And in fact, I'm thinking of changing it to My 100 Loves, because it's actually about the loves of one body. It's a story of a life told through the body. So it means the loves, the things she drinks, the feel of, sun against her skin, as well as physical lovers. But I'm really interested in how love inhabits us from every angle, how it inhabits the body, fills our eyes, not just our hearts. And in The Landing, everyone is also searching for love in some way, whether it's for work to love, because I think that's a great gift if you can find work that you love, whether it's for the love of a man or a woman, or again, the parent for a child. And as I've said, the search for love is nothing less than the search for life itself in its broadest, fullest sense. So I just wanted to say Happy Valentine's Day again, but in its fullest, broadest sense. Don't squish all the difficult, terrible, wonderful love into its little box. And I know most of you won't, and not exactly, this won't be news to you, but let's not let the corporate giants of the world eat the word love as well, because, so much of our lives have been taken over by, global multinationals in some way, whether it's even, we had a small chat about libraries, whether it's libraries and Google, Amazon. I say go out and celebrate in your own way, whether it's just hugging a friend, whether you may or may not, you may be lucky enough to be in a period of limerence, I don't know, but just tell someone you love them. You don't necessarily have to buy a Valentine's Day card, but maybe read a book you love instead. And I just think humans are so talented at not only limerence, but also at real love. And it's real love that we all live for. So that was really what I want to say. So thank you.
Thank you, Susan. I've got some questions now, and the first one is to do with another great writer of love, courtship and marriage, Jane Austen. So Jane Austen lived over 200 years ago, as we know, and she's still as popular as ever, and contemporary authors are still taking her characters and creating whole new storylines for them. With your book, The Landing, you start with a very cheeky take on the famous Pride and Prejudice introduction. If a separated man, about to be divorced, is in possession of a good fortune, must he be in want of a new wife? Can you tell me a little bit about why you used this for your opening sentence?
Well, firstly, I'm a huge Austen fan, and I don't know anybody really who doesn't love Pride and Prejudice. I was interested in modelling in the broadest way the characters in The Landing on the idea of people being in a small place, because what Austen wrote about mainly was very, very small places. I mean, she wrote about minute hamlets and villages. In those days, if you were alive, you may meet 200 people during the whole course of your life. Now, just compare that to how many people we all know in our lives, how we're connected, not just in social media, but by travel, and the vast, vast numbers of people that pass across any human life now. So The Landing is actually set in a very, very small place. And so I wanted to keep that kind of vision of a small place. And how The Landing came about was when I came back to Australia, a friend of mine had a house in a beach resort inland of Noosa. And as we're coming in, he was sort of pointing out at all the houses, you know, in that house over there, that guy ran off with that woman in that house over there. She drank herself to death or whatever. And I thought that would make a really nice little enclosure almost. You know, so I came back sort of just already filled with this idea of writing something in a small place. And as I thought about it, I thought, well, it's actually what Austen did in some way. She actually took just a very small cast of characters. It provides a very nice little fence around them almost. So that was the kind of inspiration. And of course, I didn't want to start with "It is a truth universally acknowledged," because so many books have started with that. But I wanted to nod to her, but without starting with it's a truth universally acknowledged.
I'm wondering if you've had a chance to read Seth Grahame-Smith's take on Pride and Prejudice, and it's called Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. It's currently showing at the movies in Brisbane. It's a great mix of zombie killing, ballroom dancing and love, and it's a really joyous rewrite. I'm wondering what you'd make of that.
Well, I must admit, when I first heard about it, I thought, oh, how dare they? And then I thought, actually, you know, the whole history of art and creation is one of appropriation and reinvention, isn't it? I mean, you know, in visual art or in film or in literature, you know, really not since, you know, maybe the first novel, which everyone says is possibly Gulliver's Travels. The notion of narration has always been reinvented the whole time. And in fact, I myself did it with The Broken Book, because I took the story of Charmian Clift and George Johnston. I'm not sure how many of you are fans of the George Johnston trilogy. And well, I wrote The Broken Book in 2004, kind of inspired by Charmian Clift. And if none of you have read Charmian Clift, do read her. So I think everything's up for grabs. I do think that really, in a way, that's how 50 Shades came about. That was fan fiction, based on Stephanie Meyer's Twilight series. That's right. So, you know, I think good on it. And in fact, you've inspired me to go out and seek it out. So maybe I'll have a read of it now. So,
it's fantastic. Yeah. I'm just finishing it now.
Yeah.
And I can really recommend it. Are there any other great writers that you really admire, and why?
Well, actually, of course, I do love Middlemarch and, you know, Edith Wharton, they're my kind of talismans. And of course, Madame Bovary, I think, is just a masterpiece. And Tolstoy, who writes like Tolstoy? I mean, I don't even know how he does it. He's a genius. He's like the breadth of humanity that he gets into those stories, and the fact that they're still alive today. You read a page of War and Peace, and it's now being currently readapted for the BBC. If you read a page of that, it's as fresh as if it was written last month. It's just astonishingly good. So all those, but domestically, I love Helen Garner. I'm a huge Helen Garner fan. I'm also a great fan of the kind of wonderful fiction you get out of America, like Franzen. I love Jonathan Franzen. And I'm really interested. One of the topics I'm doing at Perth Writers Festival this week is why, when women write about the domestic, it's just seen as kind of women's stuff, but when blokes write about it, it's often deemed great literature. And I know that Franzen himself has been a huge supporter of women's writing, and he's a great fan of Christina Sted's, and he also thinks it's deplorable that it's only when blokes like him write about the domestic. So I'm a huge Franzen fan. I love Richard Ford as well. I tend to like American writers actually more than English writers, current English writers. I find them a bit cerebral and a bit restrained. I mean, there are some that I enjoy. I'm trying to think of a contemporary English writer who I read, and none springs to mind, so that's interesting. Julian Barnes, I can admire a lot of them, but I don't love them. Do you know what I mean? Reading is such about your own sensibility. I mean, it's so much about your own experiences, and it's why someone will love one book. I have just entered this huge debate on Facebook about that book, A Little Life. Has anyone read it? She's a Korean American writer. And people either adore it and say, I've lost weeks of my life, I can't put it down, I've got to read it, endlessly. It's really thick. It's about this thick. It's really, really thick. It's probably about that thick. It's 780 pages, I think. Or people really loathe it. And I was in the latter category. I was prepared to love it, but if none of you want to talk about it, I won't go on about it. But, it's one of those books that people either adore or they don't. So it's such a personal thing.
Susan, Indigenous authors in Australia, can you recommend for our audience?
I'm a huge fan of Indigenous writing, and I'm also a very good friend of Anita Heiss's. And I don't know if any of you have read, Anita is hilarious. She's got Swiss heritage from her dad, and her mum descends from people around Cowra and that part of New South Wales, and she says she's the darkest in her family, and she says the closest she gets to the stars and is 5-star at the Hilton. She's very, very funny. And the closest she gets to kangaroo is kangaroo meat in the cold section of the deli. She's a very funny woman, and she writes these really, really challenging, in many ways, books about young Indigenous women who are doing everything that other young women are doing, young white Australian women, they're wanting love, they're wanting good jobs, they're wanting all the things that, she kind of really subverts in a really great way our notions that our Indigenous people are just dispossessed or whatever. Melissa Lukashenko is another wonderful writer. And I think she lives out this way, actually. She's really great. I would definitely seek her out. And there's this absolutely stunningly good, she's 25 years old, writer called Ellen Van Nernen, who has just won, her collection of short stories has just won a number of prizes. I'm sure you'd have her book here. His name escapes me, but it's a collection of short stories. So, no, there are some really wonderful Indigenous writers coming up.
Thanks, Susan. One of the great books for Anita Heiss is Titters. So if you ever get a chance, borrow Titters. We have it in the library. She spoke about it last year, and it was just fantastic. Getting back to the landing, Susan, is there a double meaning in the title, The Landing?
Yes, well, it's supposed to represent a physical place, but of course it also represents the idea of a more existential landing, like a landing towards love, towards one's place in the world, I guess. So I really wanted to have that double meaning. And in fact, we've had a big debate also about the cover. Lots of blokes are turned off by it because they think it's a romance book. So I don't know what you think, but I mean, it actually goes very well with my other cover, which is the other book that I did with Alan and Unwin, which is called My 100 Lovers. But we're thinking it might look a bit too girly. I don't know. But, the covers are sort of important as well. So we may change it for the next one and have a more, I did find this really lovely image of a man jumping off a pier just into open water. It's a really, really beautiful image. So we might do something like that next Yeah, that's right. I think that might make it more in keeping with what's inside, I guess. Yeah.
So is there a physical place you had in mind for the setting of the book?
There is. I mean, there was this little hamlet by a lake, but I didn't want to name it because I wanted it to be kind of placeless. And I also didn't want everyone to say, oh, that's not right, that's not here. But funnily enough, I did one lecture and this young woman came up to me and she said, I have a feeling, I know where that is, and I have a feeling, I've got a local shop in it. And she said, my parents actually ran the shop of that place. And I can tell you stories a million times worse than the ones you've got in the book. So the main thing is you don't want people trying to place it. And also, my agent is in Brussels. It's an agency that's based in Brussels and Sydney, and the agent in Brussels is a Jewish New Yorker who's actually speaking French and living in Brussels. And she said she quite liked the idea of it being placeless too, because then, when it gives New Yorkers like that sense of, maybe where you go to out of New York, or, people always have places wherever they go to. So she didn't want it to be specifically a place.
Thank you, Susan. I like the different sides of love and humanity and the points of view across the generations for some of the characters in the novel. Were these characters based on real life people or just your observations over time?
Well, I think all characters come from your own observations about who you've met, who you know. As I've said, my grandmother was one of the inspirations for Marie. And funnily enough, I was also thinking, we think that 87's pretty old, but then I was thinking, look at, this was before Rupert announced his marriage to Jerry. But, Rupert's mother was like 103, wasn't she? Dame Elizabeth Murdoch was quite a remarkable woman. And she was very physically able and emotionally able right up to the end of her life. And in fact, someone came up last night at the talk at the Brisbane Square Library and bought a book to be signed for her mother, who's turning 100 in May. And she lives independently. She lives at home. She is doing everything. She gardens. She goes out into the garden. I was thinking, my God, that's just, but I think there's going to be more and more older people. So definitely my grandmother. Then I pinched my mother's hair for Mari as well. My mother's got this absolutely wonderful silver hair, which she puts in a roll like this. And so I did pinch the hair. And several people have said, when they meet my mother, oh, so you must be Mari, which is a bit of a worry because she's not. And then, of course, I'm a divorced woman of advanced years who knows a lot of other divorced men and women. And I wanted to write a bit about the experience of divorce and how really we think it's common, and it is common because I said 1 in 2, but it's cataclysmic for families. I don't know if any of you have read Rachel Cusk's memoir, Aftermath. It's a very searing book about just the experience of leaving her husband with her 2 daughters and just how wounding and devastating it is for people. We think that divorce is nothing, but it is something. So I kind of wanted to write about that a bit as well. So, some of my own experience, I guess, it went into that. And then the other stuff was, like you certainly just, like this is my 8th novel, so you become more and more adept, I suppose, at picking up things and noticing things as you go along, I think, yeah.
Susan, you mentioned this is your 8th novel. When did you first realise that you wanted to write and that you wanted to write full time?
Well, I started off with poetry, and in fact, we went to the same school. I have one of my old school colleagues here. I finished my last years at Clayford College. I grew up in Sydney because my father, I always say, came from a mixed marriage. My father was a Queenslander and my mother was from Sydney. And then I was born here, but they went back when I was 3 months old, so I grew up in Sydney. But we always used to come up to Queensland, and Queensland was a place of great, mystery and beauty for me. And I wrote poetry at school, and I won a few prizes. But then I went into journalism. But then very quickly, journalism started to see, even though journalism's supposed to be the truth, and fiction's supposed to be the made-up things, it seems to me that the journalism is quite often the surface of things, and it's not really the whole truth, is it? I mean, it's a way of bringing news to us, but it's never really, and I'm sure we could have a big argument about what's happening to media, but that's for another discussion. That's for another day. But it became like, when I talk about the back of the tapestry and the tapestry, it seemed to me that journalism was the front of the tapestry again. It was just showing you all that unruffled, calm, composed surface. But fiction seemed to me much more truer. It showed us our real interior selves, our real selves, in some way that fiction didn't. And I remember getting more and more frustrated by it. Like when I was quite a young journalist, going out to interview Margaret Whitlam, and being so struck by the difference between her personal self and her public self. She was much more timid and hesitant and really different in private than she was, as a public self. So I'm interested in the private self, I think, more than the public self. So when I was pretty young, that happened in my early 20s. But it took me a while to work out how to write a novel, I guess, and how to put all that into a novel. And that's why I'm so keen to do teaching these days, because I really enjoy that experience of, helping people to make that transition.
In that case, what advice would you give to aspiring writers?
The first thing is, don't just talk about it, do it. That's the main thing. It's really easy to have this great idea in your head, but the really, really hard bit is actually getting it out of your head onto the paper. And the only way you're going to do that is write. And it might be completely awful. What actually freaks people out is when they write something and it's awful, and this happens to me after 10 books. We're not talking, I don't write perfect sentences or a perfect book. I write really awful stuff. But once you've got piles of words on pages, that's when you've got to do it every single day until you get that writing muscle working. Just keep writing and writing and writing. And then you've got something you can look at. Then you've got something then you can work out and see, what have you got? Is it anything any good? Is it anything truthful? Or do you start again? Do you take part of it? Is there one line maybe that you can build with? So its main thing is to get words on paper. And it kind of doesn't even matter what words. It just sort of means you've got to put some feeling or ideas or something down. I think that's the main thing.
I really love some of your words and descriptions. So one of the words that, you described yourself as struck with eternal wanderlust, and an ambivalent mother skewered by love. Would you like to give us a bit of information?
Yeah,
on
I spoke a bit about that, but I do feel that there's a lot of ambivalence in love. That when I said before, I think most parents would lay their lives on the line for their children if it came to a choice between, you and your child. Most people would. I had a very dear friend in England whose daughter was 16. and developed a sore leg, and she said, "Oh, you'll be all right, get over it. You know what kids are like, they're always coming with something." And it turned out to be bone cancer in the end. It took a while to be diagnosed, and she went through years of remission and then getting worse again. Finally had her leg amputated in order to keep her alive, but she died a few weeks after her 18th birthday. Now, I know that Elizabeth, who says, I saw her recently in London in last year, and she said it's only so that Lottie would have died in 2010, and she says it's only now that she can go through a day without crying. And I think that there's it's kind of the ambivalence of love that she racks herself daily with the idea that if only I'd got straight away to the doctor that day. But you can't do if onlys, unfortunately, in life. I mean, we do them, but so I guess that feeling of skewered by love is how I experience, and I think how most people feel it. That like I've got 2 teenage boys now who are just they're in that stage of they don't do any washing, they won't walk the dog, they won't I mean, it's just and yet I know from friends whose kids have moved out that empty nest is also a very challenging thing. So, that's kind of what I meant by that. And the wanderlust thing, I think that comes from, again, all our experiences of early childhood, whether we've got parents who came from another place, whether we speak another language, whether we, in my case, I know I can put it down to 2 things. Well, books, for a start, the notion of elsewhere. But also my dad worked for, before he chucked it all in and we moved to Queensland, I only got a bit of that story. He worked for a multinational 3M, which is Scotch tape, Minnesota mining. So he's a corporate person. He became the sales manager for 3M in Sydney, but he was a Queenslander and longed for Queensland. So when he was about 40, he was offered a transfer to St Paul Min, which was their headquarters, and it was either that was the only way up, or he was just going to stay where he was. So Dad decided he didn't want to have American kids. He didn't want to have kids split between America and going to college in America, because we knew other people who'd made that move. So he chucked it all in and bought a pineapple farm. So we moved from St Ives to Nambour High School, Nambour, and a place outside Nambour. And I was actually in the same year as Kevin Rudd, which I didn't know at the time, because he was in the academic stream and I was in the commercial stream for girls. And then we stayed there for a year, then they moved closer to Brisbane and got a bigger farm. But Dad, during those years that he worked at 3M, was always going away. He was going to Japan, and he was going to America and coming back with stories of New York in the snow. My own grandparents, when I was young, my grandfather worked for Shell, and they went in those days we'd go on a European tour. They were away for 6 months. They brought me back all these dolls from every country they went to. And so I had a notion of elsewhere being very exotic and exciting, I think. So I guess that's the birth of that, the genesis of that.
Thanks, Susan. Are you working on anything special at the moment?
I'm not, actually, because I'm working full-time. I'm the sole financial supporter of my 2 children. I am working full-time in journalism. The only way I could write this book was I got a literature board grant from the Australia Council, which gave me time to write it. I don't know how many of you know that for Australian writers, it's getting more and more and more difficult. I mentioned Amazon. So the death of small booksellers, what's happening in Amazon is that you've got a lot of the web itself has put a lot of free material out there, and you can also get a lot of self-published stuff that you can buy very, very cheaply. Publishers have been squeezed by the revolution in digital technology. Publishers, Alan, there's a couple of big bookstores that have shut down, and 40% of my own publisher, which is Allen & Unwin's, income was wiped off immediately. 40%. So the average Australian author, according to the Australian Society of Authors, earns about $15,000 a year income from their books. So it's really quite dire, and in fact there's something called parallel import at the moment, which is being debated as well. And we're hoping that the new Turnbull government doesn't abolish parallel import restrictions, because it means that Australia will be flooded yet again with cheap imports from the US. It's hard enough as an Australian writer to, I've got so many books, and yet I'm not very well known as a Australian writer, let alone as a Queensland writer. My friend Emma always makes a joke out of that. She said, well, that's because you've spent so much time running away. So, why would you be surprised that you're not included in that list? But it's really, really very, very hard to have a breakout book and to break through. So unless I can get funding, and I wrote a piece about it. I was also involved with the Queensland Literary Prize when the Newman government acts the Literary Prize. Prizes are incredibly important for writers. It's not just the money, which obviously they need in order to keep writing. It's also to get your name out there so people know that you're actually writing books, so they can read them. And I know that I wrote a piece when the Palaszczuk government reinstated it in the Courier Mail, and boy was I hammered. There are a lot of people who don't agree with the idea of giving writers money, tax-paying money, because, my argument is the cultural sector provides an enormous amount to the Australian economy, much more. In fact, in the UK, the creative sector brings in more than manufacturing, which is possibly not surprising in the UK. But even here, it's a very, very big economic factor. And so my argument is, for every book that you're supporting through your taxes, and it works out, I know, to about 20 cents per person, is actually helping the Australian economy. It's not only keeping publishers going and booksellers and printers and libraries and everybody else. It's actually really, really helping the Australian economy. So right at the moment, I can't afford to give up my life and because I'm supporting my kids. However, what I'm doing is I'm writing in the mornings. I'm very kind of disciplined. At 5 o'clock in the morning, I've started a new memoir. So that will be something that I can do that's not like the creative work that goes into a novel. A novel, needs another whole separate area, of your mind. Whereas with a memoir, you know what happened because, but with a novel, you've got to actually invent things. Yeah.
Thanks, Susan. Finally, what do you hope people take away with them after reading your books?
Well, you know what? Every writer starts out as a reader. Okay, so I'm a writer only because I loved the experience of of felt life, if you know what I mean. The experience of being alive and the difficulties of being alive, the joys of being alive, was somehow being filtered through the work that I loved. Richard Ford does that so beautifully. Richard Ford is exquisite at telling. There's a book, his latest book out now is called Let Me Be Frank With You. It's a selection of short stories, and it's just so moving and so wonderful about this kind of mystery that all of us live. Even though we go about our daily lives and, we get up and we go to our jobs and we come home every day, we all know at the heart of our existence is this mystery, And so to live for a moment and be aware of someone understanding this kind of mystery and that we're in it together and recognising this process of being alive, I guess that's what I read for, and that's what my great hope would be from someone reading my books.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
On behalf of Logan City Council Libraries, I'd like to thank Susan for joining us for our special Library Lovers Day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.